But I want to clarify, our recommendation is that we should ensure the safe disposal of produced water in percolation pits with appropriate testing and treatment, or by phasing them out. So it is conceivable that appropriate testing and treatment of the water before it reaches a percolation pit could also resolve the problem. If those types of measures aren't put in place, then perhaps phasing out is the only alternative.
When can we get an answer to that question? I mean, we know there's a problem. How long is it going to take for us to be proactive, whether it's to, do work before we put them in the pits or phase them out? The public, I mean, we have a water issue in California, if no one's been noticing, and this is the kind of information we need to know sooner rather than later. So how long is that going to take for us to be able to make that decision?
Well, ultimately, I know that the Central Valley Water Board has a program in place, and I'm sure that the people following us can answer some more specific questions about exactly what they're doing to pursue testing of the water that's going into the percolation pits. But from a scientific perspective, I'm sure Dr. Stringfellow can comment on how well developed the appropriate tests are and how long it would take to get results.
Yeah, I think it's going to take some time because there's a lot of pits and a lot of measurements that need to be made. Potentially, if you have a infiltration pond and it's full of very clear, clean water, it's helping recharge the groundwater, potentially, okay? So that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case from what we're aware of at this point.
That's the problem, isn't it? If it were clean, we wouldn't have a problem.
Right.
Okay.
So it just makes it hard to say, don't do this no matter what in any case. But in general, and this is speaking for myself, not for the council together, is people are pretty shocked that we're still doing this in California.
Most states have.
I would think
Most
so.
states
So what would happen if we were to follow the direction of other states while we're waiting to decide whether or not there might be some benefit? If we were to simply prohibit this going forward, what would be the impacts?
Well, then most likely produced water would have to go to some other disposal method. And as we've noted in the presentation, they all have potential drawbacks. And so we think we need to proceed with caution.
And it could be hydraulic fracturing or acid or traditional oil drilling combinations thereof that could be causing the chemicals in the petroleum.
I wonder, are there any other states that are doing this who have that data that would give us some guidance on what is the best of the options?
Well, I think part of the issue is that California is, again, fairly unique, for instance, in terms of seismicity. And so you can't necessarily draw direct information, say, from what's happened in Oklahoma.
Well, we do know what's some of the downsides of what's happening in Oklahoma, seismically, of course.
But we don't know that that applies to California.
I'm going to cut it off. And
I suspect it would be a good bet, given that before these injections, California was known to have greater seismic activity, if I'm not mistaken, than Oklahoma.
Absolutely, of course.
We're going to thank you very much for your testimony, because I wanted to go on to the response thing, but I'm looking at Assemblymember Stone, who wanted to ask a question, and my staff tells me, just as FYI, that Oklahoma, because of the concerns of seismic activity, is stopped using injection wells. Some of them that are close to potential fault lines, et cetera. Assemblymember Stone?
I was just going to say that in sort of following what Senator Allen was going after, that there seems to be some significant data gaps here, and it's frustrating to not get information sort of behind this confidentiality claim, which we saw with the chemical composition of hydraulic fracturing fluids. Turned out that there was a solution there. So I think this is something that we need to look at specifically with the injection wells, and because of the proximity of the hydraulic fracturing and that volume, I think if we don't understand how companies are establishing that volume area, given the specific geology, the areas that it's happening, and the proximity to water, we're probably never really going to get a handle on the risk of contamination of that operation to local groundwater. So without that information, without being able to draw some regulatory framework to just stop and back up in that area, I mean, how can we be exposing, especially now, groundwater basins to the kind of risk that we're seeing, especially very, very substantial groundwater basins, and given the drought that we have, if part of the problem in the regulatory environment are these significant data gaps and companies kind of hiding behind their proprietary information when that has proven not to always be the barrier that we're told it is. So I think we've got some work to do in that area.
That's one of the benefits of having this study. That was one of the requirements of SB4, and I think you made the point that looking at this a year or two from now is also important, and also further responses on seismic activity in relation. There's not enough work right now to put that in effect, separating our normal seismic activity from whether it's induced by some of our underground injection well storage.
Public disclosure rules on these kinds of things don't trigger antitrust violations. They're totally separate things, and if it is publicly accessible.
We had that argument when we required all the major chemicals being used. They finally decided.
Yeah.
They finally decided non-issue, and they're published, so we need to keep pushing it. Thank you again for your good work. Thank your entire team for their efforts. As usual, when we have these hearings, we end up with more questions than we started the day, but we appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much.
Very good science. A report based on sound science, independently reviewed, and very well done. Thank you. So now we're going to be hearing from the administration. I'd like to welcome recently appointed Director of Conservation, Dr. David Bunn. Those of you who haven't met him, please make sure that you do. Oil and Gas Supervisor, Dr. Steve Bolin. How many months on the job? Are we up to a year?
15.
15 months, see? And a familiar face to us, Jonathan Bishop from the State Water Boards, to present the administration's response to this science study. And I did receive a communication from the Secretary of Natural Resources on that there's some group of forming from the Natural Resources Agency and different agencies throughout. And so in your presentation, if you could talk to me a little bit about timelines and how you're going to respond to the report. So they have about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Who's batting first? Of course. Welcome, Dr. David Bunn.
Good morning, Chair Pavley and Williams and members. My name is David Bunn. I'm the newly appointed Director of the Department of Conservation. I've had the pleasure of meeting some of you, and I look forward to meeting the rest of you very soon. Walking over this morning to this building, it struck me that it was 30 years ago this year that I was a consultant to the Senate Committee of Natural Resources. I've had the honor of working for Senator Petras, Senator Presley, and Assemblymember Keeley. I look forward to working with all of you on all of our issues, in addition to oil and gas, agricultural and watershed conservation, mining reclamation, and seismic safety. I just wanted to share with you a little bit about my interview process for being appointed to this position. Was the one thing that was hammered to me by the administration was to really focus on creating a very effective regulatory program with good management that is efficient, that is responsive, and that is effective. And that is going to require a fair amount of reform in the next couple of years. This administration is devoted to building an effective regulatory program for oil and gas production in the state that protects the public health and the environment. The overhaul of the oil and gas division began 2 years ago, and over the last year, Oil and Gas Supervisor Steve Bolin has led fairly dramatic reforms in that division, and we will continue to make changes, significant changes, to improve the program over the next 2 years. I want to thank you for this opportunity to provide an update on SB4 and to discuss the science study. And I especially want to thank Senator Pavley for the leadership you provided in enacting SB4. I've heard a fair amount about it, and that it wasn't an easy bill to enact, and I think at one point or another, probably all sides criticized it very often. That is a sign of a very good piece of policy when it reached the finish line. We are devoted to the implementation of SB4. It is a top priority. It has been a top priority and will be a top priority. And the regulations that we've enacted due to SB4. This is a new era. The oil division is 100 years old this year, and the years ahead will be a new era for how we regulate and manage oil production in the state of California. Industry is complying. We have unprecedented precautionary requirements, disclosure laws, groundwater monitoring, and neighbor notification, very much due to SB4 and also due to SB 1281. And the comprehensive science study we've been talking about today will inform additional reforms as we move forward in the department. The administration is very serious about applying good science. In fact, Senator Laird immediately established, when the reports came out, an interagency working group, which you just mentioned, to review the science and the findings of the report and provide guidance on the steps forward. The working group has already had 8 half-day meetings with the science team to review all aspects of the science, assessing data gaps, needs for additional research, and further regulatory reforms. Before I turn this over to Dr. Boland, I would like to provide, where he will provide a briefing on the implementation of SB4 and discuss the study. I want to express our thanks to and appreciation for the California Council of Science and Technology and to the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. They were given a fairly monumental task to do this research on a very tight timeline. I want to thank you again for your outstanding leadership, and many members in this committee, your outstanding leadership on conservation of California's incredible natural resources. I look forward to working with you to ensure that California's fuel demands are met in the safest and most productive way feasible as we transition to clean fuels in the next few decades. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Boland, the state's oil and gas supervisor.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you, Dr. Bunn. Another person from your neck of the woods, right. Dr. Steve Boland, welcome. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Chair Pavley. Just start talking?
Yeah.
I'll talk loudly. Thank you, Chair Pavley, and members of both committees. I think I'll begin by emphasizing what the SB4 regulations actually have in place, because it addresses a number of the issues that you had of the science, the staff of the science study. And they're not as familiar with the regulations as we are in the division. First, I think it's important to realize that SB4 regulations, the regulations developed under the Pavley bill, forbid the discharge of returned fluids from hydraulic fracturing for the life of that well into percolation pits. They have to be, those fluids have to be confined, and if they are disposed of in deep injection wells. Secondly, chemical disclosure is required. And so the division knows before any well stimulation activity takes place, a well is stimulated, that what chemicals are planned to be used, and then the required disclosure 60-day following a well stimulation, what chemicals and their volumes, their names, etc., were in fact used. No plan survives its collision with reality, and things change. Another point that I think is important for the committees to understand is that a very significant amount of work is done before a well is permitted to be stimulated around ensuring confinement of the fluids into the zone intended. That's why we developed this concept of this unfortunate term ADSA, which is really a volume within which the fractures should take place. There's a geologic review that's required to show that the fractures cannot propagate out of that zone. There are both hydrologic and geologic controls. In addition, the division has access, complete access to the engineering models that are used for the calculation of that volume and all the engineering calculations. So we have the opportunity and actually must certify that by regulation that we have looked at that volume and agree with the engineering studies of the companies. There are a variety of standard fracture models that are used within industry. These are well known. We are getting training, independent training on these fracture models, their strengths, their weaknesses, and getting support from national laboratory staff on fracture mechanics. So this is an area that is both highly watched and understood, and the regulations are put in place to assure that the stimulated volume is does not get out of zone and fluids don't leak into places that we don't want them. Additionally, because we are witnessing 100% of the well stimulations, one of the things that you can watch as a regulator is the pressure of injection. And if that pressure deviates from a specified amount that you anticipate for a given engineering set of conditions for the well, a regulator has the ability to stop the injection because you may have encountered a fault or whatever that could allow fluids to escape from the zone. So I certainly understand a lot of the questions that the committee has about what actually happens downhole. The regulations that have been put in place are really designed to make certain we know what goes on downhole, and that those fluids are confined within the zone that are intended. So I wanted to clarify what I think could potentially be some misperceptions articulated by the science team because they weren't as familiar with the regulations that we have put in place and that we are forcing industry to adhere to very rigorously. Moving on to, this has been a busy year. We have been busy developing the regulations for SB4. We have been busy then developing the program to regulate. We have a very high degree of witnessing of all of the activities, the well completions, the pressure tests, the well stimulations themselves, exceeding 88% witnessing of all activities, 100% of the well stimulations. We have been working to get Senate Bill 1281 implemented. We just released the first data from the first quarter and are working with the operators to improve their both their compliance and how they report the data. And of course the science study, which as has already been mentioned, the science study has come out, and the Governor Brown established the interagency working group, and that working group has been busy with 8 half-day meetings where various state agencies have been getting together to dive into the science report much more fully, understanding the data, understanding how the data and the conclusions how the data were used to establish the conclusions. This has involved the Natural Resources Agency, the Cal EPA, Fish and Wildlife, Department of Public Health, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, Department of Toxic Substance Control, the Air Resources Board, obviously the Department of Conservation, and the Department of Industrial Relations. There is considerable work underway, and that there will be a plan as to how all of these agencies working together in various combinations will address many of the complex recommendations of the science report later in Q4. But what I can say, though, is that there's a number of recommendations that the division working with the Water Board or Department of Toxic Substance Control or some other state agency are already embracing and working on. To give just a few examples before I conclude my comments. the recommendation 1.1 to assess the SB 1281 data after sufficient data are collected. We think that's absolutely imperative. Working with the federal agencies to increase their reporting and regulatory requirements. We met yesterday with Bessie, the Bureau of Safety for Engineering and Environment for the Department of the Interior, about what can be done to improve their reporting as recommended by the science study. Looking at an in-depth study of the potential for hydraulic fracturing in the state by the U.S. Geological Survey. I used to oversee that program, the energy program, when I was the head of the science programs at the USGS, and I'm in contact with them to see where a petroleum source assessment is in their priority list. Tracking the monitoring the activity in the Monterey Formation. That's something the division is doing. Chemicals, we are looking into green chemical technologies that are being deployed by the industry. The industry is moving very, very quickly. We know, for example, now they sterilize their guar gum before they put it down the wells in some certain circumstances so they can eliminate biocides and so forth. So there's very rapid movement on what chemicals are used and how they are deployed. We're working with DTSC, Department of Toxic Substance Control, to have in-depth analysis of the recovered fluids over time so that we have a much better handle on what's coming back out of the stimulated wells and so forth. So there's a lot of action in that area. I've already addressed the issue around sumps. None of the recovered waters from stimulated wells can go into percolation ponds. Their recommendation on seismic and looking at induced seismicity, we are about ready to sign a contract with the national labs to have a study in this area. Evaluation of conduits to fresh water, I've addressed that through the regulations that are already in place. Digitizing data, as you know, the legislature approved a budget that contains funds for the division to have a modern well data management system, and we're pursuing getting that in place as quickly as possible, and so forth.
Since you've returned to your confidence about the detention of fracking operations within the site and associated chemicals within the site, how can you be so confident? I mean, you know, I have a lot of sympathy for you. I wanted to give a congratulations to Dr. Bunn for his position, and I want to reiterate my condolences to Dr. Boland for his position. I mean, you walked into this job and you found out that your department had improperly permitted 2,500 underground injection wells. You know, are these different people that are improperly permitting 2,500 wells? Aren't they the same people who are regulating whether fracking chemicals stay on site? And how can you possibly be so confident and a little dismissive of the findings of the scientists in the face of that?
Well, if I was dismissive, I certainly don't mean to be. They're my colleagues in science, and I know them all well and value their input. My comments were really towards Dr. Stringfellow's comments about us not knowing, and we know a lot. I myself am a geologist. I've worked in the subsurface. I've understood crustal evolution, and I understand that the subsurface is a very complex place. My point is that the regulations have we have considerable teeth in those regulations to obtain a very large amount of data that allow us to have a high degree of confidence. There's nothing certain in the subsurface, but we do know
that fluids are contained within geologic formations for hundreds of thousands and millions of years. An oil reservoir is an oil reservoir because those fluids have been contained. So given the right engineering and given the right safeguards, you trust but verify. You verify through your observations of what's going on when you stimulate a well with the ability to stop what's going on if things aren't as they should be. So is it 100% certain? No. What I'm saying is that there are some very robust regulations, and the division spends a very significant amount of time making certain that we have a good handle on what has a high probability of happening downhole. Is there 100% certainty? No, sir.
Do you admit that that doesn't mean a lot if the associated chemicals stay on site, if they just move a mile down the road and sink it in a percolation pond or an improperly permitted underground injection well that then is connected to a beneficial use, right? I mean,
So as you know, we're working very hard. It's been an exciting year. We're working very hard to get back in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. We have a compliance schedule. We know that the great majority of those wells that were improperly permitted are enhanced oil recovery wells into geologic formations that contain hydrocarbons. So they do not contain water that is considered to be a source of drinking water.
Sure, so we may have only poisoned 100 or a couple hundred wells that may be used for beneficial use, not 2,500. I get that, but how, you still haven't been able to tell us how that happened. So how can you be confident that it does not continue to happen?
Well, because, I think there is a new focus in the division on regulatory compliance, and that's being looked at very carefully. As you know, I have removed several staff from leadership positions, and we are bringing new leadership to the organization. So it's a very big job. We have some very bad habits. I've been very honest about that. I have spent a year even having private conversations with you and others on the committees, putting the challenges of the division in a clear light on the table in front of you. And we are working through those. We have a plan to do that. We are working through it with EPA. We have a renewal plan that we will sort of put a sharp focus on all of the activities that we are doing. So,
no, that's responsive. I guess my last one is just on your question about information. You agreed with the recommendation in the report of the need for more study, and that there is significant data gaps that they have indicated. Does the department support filling those gaps, and how would the department support that? Would you be telling permittees that to get a permit, you need to give us this data, or would you be willing to, would you be funding that increased gaps? How would you, if you agree with that, how would you actually back up that agreement with effort?
So it depends on the data gap. Some of the data gaps are not in the division's, realm of expertise. Some of them relate to health studies and so on and so forth. And as I said earlier, we will be moving forward with our other agencies to have a plan in place. So absolutely, I'm a scientist at heart.
The data gaps that are within your jurisdiction. Many of these, I mean, you just saw the data, people check off other, right?
Right.
But if the person who's giving them the permit says, other's not a responsive answer, we need to know this information.
Correct.
They're going to give you a different answer.
Right, that's correct. And we're working with the operators and gaining clarity, because this gets into some of the arcane aspects of how we collect our data, but the disposition codes and what they mean and defining those and working with the operators, articulating to the operators how they're supposed to use those codes and requiring them to do so. So that's a lot of remedial work that we are busy doing. And our field staff are very, very busy, and I'm holding them to a higher standard.